Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Emily Smith-Cardino. I'm the Director of Insights here at Cake and Arrow, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some insights from several years of research we've been doing into gig economy, the gig economy, and into gig economy workers. Just a little bit about Cake and Arrow before we get started. We're an experience design and innovation company. We work mostly with organizations in the insurance industry, our work includes digital product and service design, customer research and insights, which we'll be sharing with you today, and business strategy and design, education, and thinking. Our mission is really to help carriers and brokers create authentic and meaningful relationships with their customers, and as well as their employees and policyholders. So as a part of this mission, we really believe that the insurance industry needs to shift its focus from the needs of businesses to those of customers. We believe that great innovation starts with really understanding human needs and real human problems. So rather than focusing, again, on business problems, looking at the human being as a whole and identifying opportunities through that lens. We believe that there needs to be a shift in customer expectations, or rather, we believe that there is a shift in customer expectations right now, but this shouldn't be a threat to the insurance industry, but rather an advantage. And finally, we believe that delivering real value to customers will require new ways of working, thinking, and solving problems. That's a little bit about Cake and Arrow. And now let's talk about the topic at hand, which of course is the gig economy and gig workers. So before we dive into the research, just a little background on Cake and Arrow work in the gig economy and kind of how we got started there. So back in 2017, we were kind of doing some work with a large global carrier, a customer of ours, investigating the small commercial space. And we were seeing some interesting trends between kind of the blending of personal and professional lines and how this was influencing insurance needs. So as we sort of dive deeper into researching the world of small commercial business, we realized that a part of the issue that we were seeing was the rise of the gig economy, kind of fueled by platform growth, and how this was kind of shifting the idea of what a small business was, as well as shifting the idea of what insurance for individuals looked like. And so that kind of got us started on our initial research in December of 2017, where we did a survey of gig workers and published some insights around that. From there, we've done many number of projects with clients, as well as original research, to really get to know this space and who this gig economy worker is. And the most recent of which is research we just recently completed last month, where we surveyed gig economy workers and talked to them about their experience with COVID. So just to level set a little bit here, I think one of the things you see in the gig economy, and I think it's part of why it's hard to talk about, is this idea of what the gig economy actually is not really agreed upon generally. And so we tend to define the gig economy pretty broadly as far as these definitions go. So it's inclusive of all the work performed by independent workers, whether that be facilitated through a platform like Lyft or TaskRabbit, or sourced through more traditional channels. And our definition also includes the sharing economy. So Airbnb and workers earning money by renting or sharing their assets. So again, just keep that in mind, that that's kind of our broader definition as we dive into our work here. So over the course of these 3 years, as we've investigated the gig economy and gig economy workers, we've had the chance to survey and interview more than 3,000 gig economy workers. And we do this in a number of ways. So some of it is through these more kind of quantitative surveys and assessment, but a lot of our work falls into the category of qualitative interviews, where we actually sit down and talk with individual people and have kind of long, in-depth conversations with them. In addition to this, we do platform and partner landscape reviews, where we kind of look more at the larger landscape of the gig economy, And then again, we do new product concept design and validation, where we kind of design new products in the gig economy space and test them and validate them with actual gig economy workers. So that's kind of where the insights that we're going to be talking about today come from, are from these 3,000 gig economy workers that we've spoken with over the last couple of years. And this has sort of, resulted in a number of different white papers and products that we've individually designed, things we've designed for our clients, but it's also really kind of become a part of our DNA. And we've had the chance to do quite a bit of education within the insurance space around the gig economy. And, I encourage you, and we'll talk a little more about this at the end, to visit our website and look more closely, if you haven't already read some of these reports, into the research that we've done into the gig economy, as well as millennials, where I think there's some overlap, as we'll talk in a little bit. So that being said, I think, what's important to remember about the work we'll be presenting today is it's really about connecting with this human side of gig workers. And so rather than really talking about trends in the gig economy, I think we want to focus more on who are these gig workers and what do we think we know about them, versus, what is actually true about them, and that our perspective on that is really shaped through these individual conversations that we've had over the years with gig workers. So the title of today's webinar is Mythbusting the Gig Economy. So over the course of our years of research, one thing that has been made clear is that the term gig economy emerged post the 2008 financial crisis. A narrative around the gig worker has been spun up, namely by the gig platforms themselves. And so the gig platforms have kind of told us that gig workers are young and they're free and they're independent, and the gig work is really about taking control over your life and your destiny and not being beholden to anyone but yourself, not being beholden to that 9 to 5 and to that more traditional workplace that is limiting and controlling of your life. And so while this is the narrative that's really been sold to us over the years, it's not, I think the last couple of months throughout the pandemic has actually really poked a lot of holes in this narrative and revealed it not to be true. And that's really what we're going to be talking to today. And we've known, I think some of us anyway, have had sort of a suspicion that this narrative isn't necessarily true, but it's been hard to really embrace another narrative because it's pushed on us so hard, and it's something that we really want to believe in. And what's been interesting for us is just, when we started this research, that was definitely the narrative we kind of had bought into. But very quickly it became clear that even as far back as 2013, 14, 15, people have been calling this narrative into question and really pointing to some of the problems that exist with the gig economy and the way that it sort of removes people from this traditional workplace and tends to create more risk and sort of turn them into unwilling entrepreneurs. And so this is really what the context for what we're going to talk about today is this idea of kind of what that gig platform is telling you about the gig economy versus the truth of the gig economy. And again, it's a truth that we've actually known for quite some time, but maybe now as we've seen the economy kind of crumble in the last couple of months and seen more and more people pushed into gig work, some of the limitations of the gig economy, of an economy sort of structured without the protections and benefits of a traditional employment, of a traditional employer. This has really made clear some of these issues with the gig economy and made them more undeniable, I think. So myth one about gig workers. So I think we have this stereotype of gig workers that they're millennials. So, and a lot of us have absorbed this popular stereotype that gig workers are these young millennials sitting at coffee shops on their, fancy technology, wearing like jeans and sunglasses and cool clothes, and just, really shirking the responsibilities of traditional employment in favor of this much more fun, flexible, free life. And while this stereotype is pervasive, and even if you go back a couple of screens and you see the kind of people that are advertised on these gig economy platforms, they look like these millennials, and that largely drives our perception of them. But of course, what we have found is that this isn't necessarily true. So according to our research, millennials don't actually really fit the stereotype of this young, free gig worker. I think first and foremost, it's important to note just the millennials aren't really kids anymore. The oldest of them are now approaching 40 years old. The youngest are, most of them like in at least the beginnings of their careers. 71% of those we surveyed a couple of years ago were working at full-time jobs, and 87% rank stability and security as important or very important. And, they're thinking about the future. It's their number one priority as far as where they would put any extra money that they had. And a lot of them are already kind of deeply involved in raising families and doing some of these more traditional things that we don't necessarily think of them doing. So I think just generally speaking, that stereotype of what a millennial is doesn't hold true. But it's also true that millennials, just generally speaking, are not really overrepresented in the gig economy. So according to an EY survey done in 2018, only 7% of millennials rely on gig work as their primary source of income, and 60% do not participate in the gig economy at all. And, millennial participation in the gig economy, if you look at the data, is really roughly roughly corresponds to their participation in the labor force at large. So you can see 38% of the full-time workforce is comprised of the full-time independent workforce is comprised of the millennials versus 35% of the entire workforce. And you can see within these categories, it's pretty commensurate across the board as far as the generations go. And what is true, though, I think, is that, well, as we just saw, millennials do make up the larger portion of the gig economy workforce. They also make up the larger portion of the labor force at large right now. But they also tend to participate more in certain sectors of the gig economy than other groups of people, which may kind of explain where this idea of the millennial being the gig worker comes from. So for instance, we can see here that these 1099 employees, they tend to be, 1099 contractors, these people tend to be a little bit older, the average age being 46, and a large portion of them actually being in this 55 plus category, which, actually may lead us to speculate that a lot of the people that are participating in the gig economy are actually retirees who are just looking to make some extra money or support themselves during retirement. Whereas the short-term W-2 employees, they tend to be younger. And I think there's, I'm pretty certain there's actually data that shows these platform workers also tend to be younger. So yeah, it's just important, I think, to note here that the gig economy is comprised of all generations, all different age groups work in the gig economy, and millennials may work in certain sectors of the gig economy, are more likely to work in certain sectors of the gig economy than other generations. This kind of points or validates some of our own research here, but contrary to popular mythology, millennials actually strongly prefer a full-time career. So this is from the New America Survey, which is a survey of millennials that's updated every other month. So the data is very, very recent. But according to this survey, millennials, when broken down by all races, all of them strongly prefer to work full-time jobs as opposed to short-term contracts or gig work. And the majority of them actually have these full-time jobs. And the trend of millennials having full-time jobs has actually been growing. So back in 2016, 45% of millennials had full-time jobs, whereas in 2018, 66% of them have full-time jobs. But I think what's important to remember here is that these wins, these hard-earned wins from millennials who, did a lot of work to recover from that 2008 crisis may be short-lived due to coronavirus. So just looking at some numbers over the last couple of months, millennials have been deeply, deeply impacted by coronavirus, perhaps more than other generations. 62% under 45 have lost jobs, been furloughed, or had their hours cut. So that's a huge percentage of, millennials, also a little bit of Gen X in there, and Gen Z, of course, too, who have really suffered under what the virus has done to the economy. And I think, the important context here too is some people think that that the coronavirus will be worse for millennials than any other generation simply because they were already facing so many setbacks because they were so deeply impacted by the 2008 financial crisis and had sort of finally started to recover from that when this hit. So they're sort of, their coming of age was kind of sandwiched between these two really destructive things that happened to our economy. So that being said, the truth here is that yes, millennials are in the gig economy. Yes, they do make up a larger portion of gig economy workers than other generations, but the gig economy is not heterogeneous. All generations participate in the gig economy, and millennials, are the largest part of the workforce at large, as they are of the gig economy right now. And, if they do end up kind of overtaking the gig economy, it may not be out of choice, but due to the economic pressures that leave them no other options, as we've seen recently with the pandemic. So myth 2, gig workers are platform workers. So again, we have this stereotype of the gig worker as a platform worker. But if you were to, if you were to Google image search the words gig economy or gig worker, you might turn up an image like this, a kind of younger, tech-savvy hipster scrolling through the apps on his phone looking to book his next gig. And while this might represent a portion of who gig economy workers is, it definitely does not represent the majority. So platform work gets a ton of attention, and in some ways it really, I think, dominates our perception of what the gig economy is. But in reality, it only makes up a small percentage of gig work. So we know that 25% or more of all workers engage in the gig economy in some capacity, but only 1% of all workers have used an online gig platform to arrange work in the past month, and 8%, and another number here, 8% who do platform work year-round have earned money in the last year from an online employment platform. And the difference between these two numbers is really this 1% is kind of based on this more limited idea of what platform work is. So Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, where you arrange actual work, while that 8% actually includes people selling goods in online marketplaces like Etsy or eBay, or even taking online surveys to earn a little extra cash. But even when you expand that definition, you can see the percentage is still quite low in context of the larger workforce. So that being said, among those that do platform work, it's still really a side hustle. So the vast majority of platform workers spend less than 3 months each year doing that platform work, and only 10% of those platform workers work year round. So when you kind of look at that, those numbers from the last slide, it really even further diminishes how much the platform work is prominent within the gig economy. So that being said, nevertheless, the number of independent workers has grown and continues to grow. And this is indeed fueled by on-demand platforms. So We do know that more and more platforms have emerged over the last few years. You know, we started with Uber and Lyft, and then there's been a number of other ride-sharing platforms and platforms where you can, you know, sign up to do deliveries, sign up to do small tasks like TaskRabbit, and it seems like the number of these platforms is expanding every day. And that is, in fact, helping fuel this growth within the gig economy. And alongside that, as we see more platforms, consumer participation and spending in the on-demand economy is actually growing too. But I think the story that often doesn't get told about what's happening here is that as consumers demand more and these new platforms emerge and more workers sign up, these consumers start to make choices. They start to get savvy. They start to, you know, choose Lyft over Uber. And in that competitive landscape, prices go down for consumers, but that is really a burden that the workers bear, not these actual companies. So while the companies are making more money, the workers are making less money as these platforms try to compete with each other. So wages in the gig economy have actually been diminishing for some time. You can see here that while consumer spend is going up, consumer spend per person is going down. And, you know, some commentators have referred to this as kind of the hustle to the bottom. So as more platforms are modeled to offer some minimum wage and tip dependence, workers are kind of incentivized to do more faster for less. And you've probably seen some stories about this kind of thing happening over the last few months, especially with like when, you know, everyone during the coronavirus started getting their groceries delivered, and there's all these workers kind of flooding the market and competing for these jobs. And that being said, again, this is driving wages down. And you know, I think the ride shares are a good example, and this has been happening for some time. But there's been a 53% decrease in driver earnings between 2013 and 2018, and it'll be interesting to kind of look at some data after, you know, after this year to see how the coronavirus kind of is driving those wages down even further. So this really exposes, you know, what we've sort of described as a class divide within the gig economy that leaves some much more exposed than others. And so these platform workers, they tend to be lower skilled workers and thus like lower paid workers, and they sort of comprise one half of this class divide, whereas you have these more traditional freelancers that are doing you know, things like they're jewelry makers, they are freelance thought workers who are consulting or doing graphic design, they're coders and tech workers, and they sort of comprise the other half of that class divide. And when we surveyed gig economy workers right after the pandemic struck back in March, we found that these platform workers were much more likely to be exposed to risk than the more traditional type of freelancers. So when we asked them what their number one concern was amidst the pandemic, only 3% of these kind of professional creative services workers named their health, while 14% of all other workers named their health. And when you started kind of breaking this down by different platforms or industries, you saw that rideshare drivers and delivery workers were very concerned about their health, especially in comparison to what you saw with these other types of workers. And, you know, that means that and a part of what we uncovered too is that freelancers were just generally more insulated to risk. So they tended to be more financially prepared for a period in which they might not work. So they had saved money, partly because they were able to make more money than platform workers. They're also more likely to still be working amidst the pandemic. So a lot of these people are, as freelancers, were people who worked from home. And, you know, fewer of them lost work than these other types of workers. And again, as we just discussed, they were less concerned about their physical health. And again, this may be largely just because they're able to work from home and make money from home. And the pandemic has only kind of tightened this market. and not just for platform workers, everyone's been affected. So there was data that came out in April that showed that there was a 50% increase in freelancer signups on Upwork. There were 3 times more Instacart workers in April than there were in March. And then, of course, this was kind of teamed with this drop, this huge historic drop in consumer spending in April. And while that's recovered somewhat, these recoveries have been sort of precarious. And this has kind of amounted to lower wages for everyone. And I think what the concern amongst a lot of gig workers is today is that this is going to kind of represent a permanent shift in their work and how much money they're able to make off of that work. So even while platform work represents a small percentage of work, it's really slowly changing the definition of work and how we think about and treat workers by, as we kind of talked about earlier, converting workers into entrepreneurs and users and removing both worker protections and the capital risk of the traditional workplace. And that's the thing about, I think, the platform work as well. It's this really small percentage of the actual work. It's really changing what the definition of work is and how people see work and themselves. So platform work, again, comprises a small portion of actual gig work. And most of this platform work is kind of seen as a side hustle, but it's contributing to the growth of the gig economy, which is indeed growing. And again, it's kind of changing that definition of work and setting sort of new terms and conditions for what employment means. All right, so myth 3. So myth 3 is probably the greatest myth, I think, that we're sold about the gig economy. And this is the myth that gig work is a choice. So we think of gig workers as kind of making a clear choice between the sort of stuffy constraints of a full-time job and the freedom and flexibility of gig work. So that the freedom to work in your pajamas whenever and wherever you want and kind of set the terms of your labor. But what we found in our research is that what we mean by choice isn't that binary, and that the choices that gig workers aren't necessarily between full-time work and gig work, but for some they're between gig work and no work at all. For some, they're between full-time work or being able to be there for their families in a way that feels right to them and feels good to them. For some, it's really a choice between working in a field they love or a job they hate, or even a field they were trained for, where there may not be full-time work available. And for others, it's really a choice between making enough to live or not making it. So a lot of these workers aren't choosing gig work as an alternative, but rather as kind of an addition to their regular employment. And aside from that, even when we do look at who is choosing gig work, 2017 data from McKinsey showed that most actually don't voluntarily pursue their gig work as their primary source of income. So you can see this kind of top category where we have primary income earners versus supplemental income earners. Those are those kind of doing it as a preferred choice, while that bottom category actually represents a larger portion of the gig economy, those doing it out of necessity. And this is why we were sort of interested to find, when we surveyed gig workers in September, that 76% of them actually told us that they choose to do gig work. So we asked them, do you do it out of choice or out of necessity? And most said that they choose to do it. But when we actually started really digging into the data here, we found that this didn't really convey the whole truth of why people were doing gig work. So we found a large portion of these people who said they choose to do gig work were actually people working in creative professions where there's little full-time work available. So we're talking about, costume and fashion designers, people working in the film or TV industry. And I apologize for my barking dog upstairs. So yeah, they said that they were choosing gig work, but really if they wanted to stay in their field, there wasn't really a choice for them. Another chunk of these people were parents and caregivers who really wanted to stay in the workforce, but couldn't really fulfill their obligations to their families and have a full-time job. So we saw, someone who was a caretaker of a disabled person, and gig work really allowed them to, keep doing what they needed to do for this person while also making an income for themselves. And, I think there's actually data that shows that more women do gig work than men for this very reason. And then finally, amongst these 76% who said they do gig work as a choice, many were aging workers who were having trouble finding other work. So they had left the workforce for one reason or another and were trying to re-enter and couldn't get full-time work at their age. Or had gotten out of bad jobs and weren't able to get hired full-time anywhere else. And so again, it really calls into question what this idea of choice is when 76% say they choose gig work, but then when you ask them why they're doing gig work, you find reasons like these. So another thing that I think we forget too is that choice, this idea of choice is really a luxury that's dependent on a tight labor market. So some Upwork data that was published right before the pandemic in February found that freelancing by choice was up 7% since 2014, and that full-time workers were feeling more secure working independently. And this really directly corresponds with this kind of tightening of the labor market that we've seen as the economy has improved since 2008. And so while that better economy was making gig work feel more like a choice, of course, we know that the labor market no longer looks like what it looked like in February of 2020. When we surveyed gig workers back in March, 57% had ceased their gig work entirely after the pandemic hit. 32% were working much less than before. So that's, basically most of the gig workforce, and this was a large sample size, but it's at least indicative of how impacted gig economy workers were. And these, aren't full-time job people. So these are people that are already working in the gig economy who lost their jobs, and now they're competing for people who lost full-time jobs who are trying to get into the gig economy. So this idea of choice really seems pretty empty when there aren't jobs anymore. And I think what the pandemic has really crystallized for a lot more people is the way that for so many, gig work has never really been a choice. It's only, it's just the only available option or the best available option. And for many who are already doing gig work out of necessity, it's an option that's no longer on the table for them because there simply isn't enough work to go around. So this idea, this myth that gig work is a choice, while many gig workers say they choose to do gig work, the choice isn't as simple as between gig work and full-time work. It's a choice between their highest values, their families, their health, their creative passions, and the stability and protections of full-time employment. And, on top of this, employment options are often disappointing for people looking for full-time work. So this leads nicely, I think, into myth 4 is this idea that gig workers value flexibility over stability. So the idea here is that, this gig worker would rather be able to work on the beach than save for retirement and have access to healthcare. And, when you put it this way, this isn't really how the cards fall. So we found that rather than kind of a choice between stability and flexibility, gig workers were kind of doing this uneasy trade-off. And they appreciate the flexibility that gig work provides, but they're very dissatisfied with the level of stability that it survives. And this is kind of, a balance that they're constantly trying to negotiate, whether they're actually doing full-time work or gig work. And again, when we talked to gig workers in 2018, we found that their number one priority was actually their personal health and safety, whereas you can see freedom and flexibility kind of comes in last here, with the number 2 priorities kind of being the stability and availability of their work and their financial health and success. So you can see, again, this idea that these gig workers are kind of these like freewheeling devil-may-care types who aren't thinking about the future or financial stability, just simply doesn't resonate with what we found in our research. And again, we found that most independent workers work hard to create this sense of stability and security for themselves and their families. When they don't have full-time jobs, the burden of doing this falls more squarely on their shoulders, which is why it sort of makes sense that, contrary to this idea of the gig worker as this kind of risk taker, most take financial responsibilities really, really seriously. And they spend a lot of time thinking about them and figuring out how, considering the kind of precarious nature of their work, they can create a sense of stability in their lives. Still, despite the fact that there is this kind of instability with gig work, and these people do value stability, many have said in the past, at least as of June, when we talked to people about this, many have said they're committed to their gig work. So, less than 50% said that they had never considered giving it up, but that's still, a big chunk of people who are like really in it for the long haul. And amongst those who had considered giving it up, you can see things like delays in getting paid, supporting their family if they not work. These are things that they are thinking about. Excuse me. But the pandemic has really forced a reckoning here. So with the shortfalls and limitations of gig work, many gig workers are really beginning to rethink whether their current situation will be tenable going forward. So when we talked to people back in March, almost 60% told us that they are in a position where they know they now need to really pursue other income streams. And then a lot of them said things like, I need to look for more stable full-time employment. I need to find a better way to support myself, showing kind of not just a dissatisfaction, but sort of a disaffection with their gig work, and just true concern about their ability to kind of continue to support themselves and their family in the future, given the limitations of gig work. So when we spoke to them last month about how they feel about their gig work in the future, at best, they were kind of cautiously optimistic, hoping for the best. I'll actually be working in a year, hopefully some or all of it will resume. Many were just simply very uncertain. I had no idea. They didn't know what things were going to look like. And then we saw a lot of people pretty pessimistic about the future, just really believing that there would be no work for them in the future. And, on the flip side of this, we saw people who were already kind of looking for full-time work, and because they knew that their gig work was no longer really a tenable option for them. So while gig workers are often characterized as these sort of adventurous freewheelers who, want to work on the beach, they too value financial stability and security, even above flexibility and autonomy. So many are really hustling to create this sense of stability and security outside of the relationship, the more traditional relationship with the employer. But this is becoming increasingly difficult under current economic realities, and many are finding that it will no longer be sustainable. So this leads us to our last myth. Myth 5, gig workers don't want insurance. So perhaps this is the most relevant to the audience we have on the line today. But we have found, again, this is not necessarily true. Our research found that our notions of what insurance does for workers isn't necessarily shared by the workers themselves. So we think gig workers don't want insurance, which kind of leads us to think gig workers don't want to protect themselves. But the gig workers we spoke to didn't really see insurance as a way of protecting themselves. Instead, they kind of saw it more as a requirement for the job, kind of a box to check. They buy insurance because they have to, not because they necessarily want to or need, or even think that they need to, or even think that it offers them protection. It's just something they have to do to get the gig. So given this perception of insurance, it's not really surprising to find that they're severely underinsured, and many, especially platform workers, as we discussed earlier, are really at great risk. And particularly right now with the coronavirus, what would they do if they got sick and couldn't work, right? They don't, without these kind of traditional protections. So we found that the reason they don't have insurance, though, is again partly because they only get it sort of if they need it, but they also kind of lack some context or experience to really recognize their full spectrum of risk. One of the things we noticed is that while in some ways the gig economy has turned these workers into entrepreneurs, they don't really see themselves this way as this sort of businesses of one. They see themselves as employees and therefore can be naive about the risk that they're taking on as independent contractors. So gig workers trust their platforms or employers to keep them compliant with coverage requirements. And again, I think there is this sense that a lot of gig workers still, even though they don't have the protections of employees, still kind of see themselves as employees of some of these platforms. And they assume that if the platform isn't really requiring them to do something, then they don't actually really need it. And they assume that that platform is going to protect them. And when we surveyed gig workers a few years back, only a little more than half had even considered buying insurance. And the reasons they did not predictably had to do with price and with a lack of information about what they actually needed. Meanwhile, many never considered buying it at all, again, because they sort of assumed they didn't need it and they were kind of looking for their platform or their employer, or whoever was sort of hiring them for their gig work to tell them that they needed something. And so gig worker attitudes towards insurance are a little all over the place, but I think it's fair to say that they tend to not have really like strong feelings about insurance. They feel generally kind of like ambivalent and unaware about it, and it's kind of an afterthought. But at the same time, they are open to this idea that they do need more protections, and they would be open to solutions that might provide them protections, especially if they were protections that really aligned with what they perceive to be their risk. The large majority of gig workers say that they want income protection, but as you can see here, they don't actually associate income protection with insurance. So there's kind of this profound gap between independent workers' desire for income protection and their interest in insurance. And less than half of that 43% who are interested in actually purchasing workers' comp or disability type insurance products actually are policy holders. So again, just there's this mismatch between what gig workers think they need and what insurance has to offer that I really think is on the insurance industry to try to sort of bridge that gap. And among those, we saw 43% would be interested in these types of products. Among gig workers who would be interested, many of them might not actually be able to even purchase insurance for sort of financial reasons. So what we found was that even if the insurance industry could overcome the gap, few gig workers are in a position to buy these kinds of policies. The framework you see here is borrowed from the Freelancers Union and represents a kind of freelancers hierarchy of needs. Those in the bottom two categories are really struggling financially, work is sporadic, they're concerned with covering their basic needs, and insurance is kind of this higher level thing that they aren't even in really a position to think about. And then empowered freelancers have steady work, can cover their expenses, and maybe have a little extra for non-essentials, but still really aren't thinking about insurance. And it's really only this influential category up here who are a market for the insurance industry as it exists right now, because they're really the only ones who are financially stable enough to be able to purchase insurance, but also kind of have like this mindset of themselves as this entrepreneur, as this business of one who needs to be protected. So I think there's sort of two things going on here. One is this kind of mindset about risk and about who you are as a gig worker, this kind of keeping people from insurance, and the other is simply this these financial limitations of gig work. And this really bore true when we talked to gig workers about how the pandemic has impacted them back in March. 63% said they had done nothing to prepare for a loss of work or income. And among those who had prepared, pretty much the only thing they told us that they did was save money. And for most, what they had saved was not nearly enough to really carry them through the the months that they weren't working or that they were working much less. And, while we know that those kind of federal unemployment benefits kicked in eventually, for a lot of people, they didn't see these for months and months and months. And many did things like moved home with their parents as 35-year-olds simply because they had no other options. And among those who hadn't prepared, it wasn't like really this, it's not that they were irresponsible necessarily. It was more that they were living paycheck to paycheck and just didn't simply have money to save. And were worried, again, they're in those kind of bottom two categories where they're worried about covering their basic needs and can't really think beyond that and plan for the future. So while despite the fact that gig workers kind of express interest in income protection, there's no question that most remain severely underinsured. It's not that they don't want the protection insurance has to offer, they just don't really see insurance as offering that protection. So they tend to see it more as a requirement for the job. But even for those workers who do want to buy some of this insurance, most aren't really financially empowered enough to be able to access the policies that are available. So again, there's kind of this disconnect between what insurance is offering and what gig workers need, but also between the kind of financial empowerment of gig workers who aren't able to afford these policies while also being able to kind of cover their basic needs. So I think those are our myths about the gig economy. I think, it becomes very clear that idea that the gig economy platforms want you to buy into, that the gig economy is kind of this, this empowering way of making taking control over your life and being your own boss and having all this flexibility just doesn't bear true, especially with how the pandemic has impacted the economy and especially these workers. But what does seem to be true is that I think it's safe to say that the takeaway from a lot of this is simply that gig workers are really vulnerable and lack a safety net. And this makes them highly vulnerable to crisis, but especially a crisis like the one we've all faced this year. So given what gig workers and really all workers have faced over the last couple of months, is it time to really rethink our notions of stability and security and how those are tied to this idea of a full-time job? So just to kind of level set about where we're at, we saw that gig workers before the pandemic were already in a difficult situation where they were, really struggling and hustling to create this sense of stability in their life, despite the fact that they weren't getting that from their employers. But after the pandemic, this situation is even worse, where there's not gig work available to cover basic needs necessarily, plus there aren't protections from their employers. And again, I think this has surfaced something that's been going on in our economy and in our country for quite some time. And it's really a call to action to do something about the gig economy and the kind of risk that it creates for people. So all of this has really called into question some of the things that we take for granted as fundamental truths. In the US, we tend to see employers as the kind of this organizing principle in our lives. So people live and buy homes near their jobs, they make friends near their jobs, they organize their family life and vacations and schedules around their jobs. And of course, they get insurance and other benefits through these jobs. What was good while this was good at a time when perhaps labor was stronger and people had jobs for longer periods of time, it doesn't really represent the truth anymore. So we still, when we think about the gig worker though, when we think about workers in general, this idea of them really being tied to their employer this way really shapes our perception still of workers in this country. But it's actually really not that true anymore. And the pandemic has shined a light on that. So we do know that even before the pandemic hit, at least a quarter of the workforce was categorized as an independent contractor. So they were not in this more traditional relationship with their employers. And we know since the pandemic hit that tens of millions of people have lost their jobs, and they're not in a relationship like this with their employer anymore either. And we know that, like, while some of them have gotten their jobs back and unemployment has recovered somewhat since March, a lot of these people have actually only been hired back as freelancers or contractors or gig workers, meaning that even more people are now outside of this traditional relationship with their employer. And finally, even those who had kept their jobs, their full-time jobs, full-time work has changed tremendously, as most of us on this call probably know. Millions are now working remotely. You can see I'm working from the basement in my apartment. And this is really changing our perception of work, but also our relationship to our employers as really this like central figure in our lives. We've seen actually a lot of us have gotten a little bit of a taste of gig work since working or since the pandemic hit. And I think what this has really revealed to us, this experience of COVID, is that the way that we conceive of the relationship between the worker and our employer is increasingly outdated and will become even more so. Our jobs, in fact, are not the sole source of structure and security in our lives. We are all a part of a larger social fabric, bigger than the relationship between us and our employers. And that's network, it's complex, and it looks a little bit different for everyone. So, we decide where we live, not just based on our jobs, but based on where our families are, based on where maybe we went to college, based on where our partners are from, and who's in our professional network can have to do with, again, where we were educated, or where we interned, where we're employed, but also who we're connected with on the internet. And so this idea, again, of that employer really playing that central role in our lives isn't true. And but despite this, the way that we access insurance and other benefits kind of remains outside of this larger fabric and only exists in this two-way relationship with the employer. And these benefits are still really difficult for people to access when they do not have full-time jobs. So I think, if we can sort of agree that this idea of the worker is changing, and that this relationship that we sort of conceive of between the relationship, or between the employer and the worker, is outdated, it's time to really think about how we can sort of weave some of these benefits like insurance and some of the other ways that we get stability from our employers into this larger network of our lives. And we've actually seen this happen over the last couple of months with the pandemic. So the government, most notably for the first time, they've stepped in and expanded unemployment benefits to include gig workers. And for the first few months in the pandemic, supplemented what workers were getting from states. There was, of course, the federal stimulus, student programs like student loan deferment. All of these kind of expanded that idea of stability that is normally really tied to our employer, and reminded us that this can come from other sources. Individuals also stepped in. We saw charitable giving going up 28% since last year, and 43% of American households engaging in charitable giving indirectly. So, individuals can help individuals too. It doesn't necessarily need to simply come from the employer. And for those who are still in full-time work, we've seen employers and private businesses kind of step in to fill in some of the gaps that have happened since the pandemic. So offering stipends and extra time off for parents, stipends to employees to set up kind of like home offices. And according to one study, 39% of these employers were keeping furloughed employees on healthcare plans, despite the fact that they weren't working there anymore. So that being said, while all of these kind of forces have combined to help workers out during these trying times, It hasn't really been enough. And I think what we've seen in our research is that this crisis has kind of called into question this belief in individual responsibility. When we surveyed people back about a year ago in 2019, and we asked them who's responsible for providing for families, 77% said it was solely on the individual, while 27% said the government. But when we surveyed gig workers this year, and ask them in times of crisis who's responsible for ensuring people's basic needs are being met, you kind of see a complete inverse. 79% said the government had a responsibility, while 29% said this was on individuals. So while this, data is not representative or statistically significant, it definitely does indicate a trend and a kind of change in thinking. And instead of seeing the problems presented by the pandemic as a matter of personal responsibility, what we've seen is that gig workers especially see it more as a societal responsibility. So thinking back to that kind of like larger network that we're all a part of, that social fabric, with everyone pulling their weight. Mostly they see it as kind of a government responsibility, but they also see private businesses, community members and organizations and local governments and individuals themselves kind of needing to step up and play a role in helping people survive this crisis. But what is difficult about that, I think, is that while they see the federal government and private businesses as having a big role to play in kind of helping them solve some of the problems that they faced, these are actually the institutions they trust the least. The federal government, when we surveyed gig workers back in March, was the only institution that gig workers trusted less than insurance companies. And I think that if the insurance industry does want to play a role in not just better supporting gig workers, but in helping create a stronger kind of safety net for people in the post-pandemic world, this trust issue is something they're really going to need to solve. And what we found is that trust is personal. So people tend to trust the people, the institutions and organizations that are closest to them and that they interact with the most. So the questions for insurance are really, what can they learn about trust from some of these organizations and institutions? You can see people said they trust state and local governments and community organizations. But also, how can they kind of leverage these trusted networks that already exist to better reach gig workers? So in summary, by busting these myths about the gig economy, workers, we've actually busted another myth, and that is the myth that there's this kind of binary between full-time workers and gig workers. What we found instead is that gig workers are a lot more like traditional workers, and traditional workers are a lot like gig workers. It's the nature of the work that's been changing, not the people themselves. So people of all ages and professions who ultimately all want the same things: protection for themselves and their families and the flexibility to pursue meaningful work while also upholding their values around family, home, health, creative passions, etc. It's the nature, again, it's that nature of work that's changing, not the people themselves. And if we are all a little more like this gig worker, perhaps looking at the gig worker not as an anomaly, but as the future of what work will actually look like and what workers will look like, can help us kind of prioritize changing what the insurance industry is doing and what the sort of larger structures of society are doing to support workers in this country. So based on everything we've shared today, I wanted to quickly run through a few opportunities that we think more specifically exist for the insurance industry to better support these workers, again, based on research that we've done and some just product concepting and validation that we've done with clients. So one is simple: speak their language. So positioning risk mitigation products as something other than insurance. So we kind of saw that gig workers had a difficult time sort of connecting insurance products to their actual needs. And the industry needs to find ways not only to better align their product offerings with worker needs, but to just generally position these products in ways that connect with how gig workers perceive their own risk. unless their platform, advocate and educate. So help gig workers feel more entitled to support, create demand, and build a market. So unless their platforms specifically tell them about their risk and make insurance a requirement, gig workers don't think they need insurance. So the industry needs to help gig workers feel more entitled to this protection, and it's on them to create demand where they can. And this creates opportunities for insurance companies to really partner with the platforms to create relationships with platforms where they can educate and be gig workers and be there when gig workers actually need those policies. So this is just an example of a product that we designed kind of based on our original research. And the idea here was that the platforms would, the insurance industry would kind of sync with all of these different platforms and offer coverage policies for when a gig goes awry, framed as trust and safety terms, and reveals gaps in coverage where gig workers might be exempt or vulnerable. Be where they are. So gig workers assume that platforms will tell them when they need to get the job and to succeed long-term. And I think it's important, again, as we just sort of talked about, to really leverage those relationships with the platforms and then support their business. So combine income security products with business management and employment services. So help them run their gig work like a business. This kind of goes back to that idea of helping gig workers see themselves not as employees of these platforms, but as themselves entrepreneurs who have as entrepreneurs who are basically running their own businesses and need to act like a business of one. And then finally, be an ally. So build solidarity amongst gig workers, help them organize and advocate for themselves, and work with them to better serve their needs. So something that we've seen throughout our research over the last couple of years, first with millennials and now with gig workers, is this idea that while gig workers don't trust insurance and they don't trust the federal government, the people that they do trust are people like them. And I think there's an opportunity for the insurance to really build on these kinds of networks of trust that already exist and use those as kind of in ways into offering products and services to these people that actually serve their needs. So that's it. We myth-busted the gig economy. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and I just wanted to encourage you to reach out to us if you're interested in talking more about this kind of stuff. We love talking about